Irony, from ancient Greek, eirōneía, meaning dissimulation, feigned ignorance in its broadest sense, is a rhetorical device, literary technique, or event characterized by an incongruity, or contrast, between what the expectations of a situation are, and what is really the case, with a third element that defines that what is really the case is ironic because of the situation that led to it. Irony may be divided into categories such as verbal, dramatic, and situational. Verbal, dramatic, and situational irony are often used for emphasis in the assertion of a truth. The ironic form of simile, used in sarcasm, and some forms of lightheartedness can emphasize one's meaning by the deliberate use of language which states the opposite of the truth, denies the contrary of the truth, or drastically and obviously understates a factual connection. Definitions. Henry Watson Fowler, in The King's English, says any definition of irony, though hundreds might be given, and very few of them would be accepted, must include this, that the surface meaning and the underlying meaning of what is said are not the same. Also, Eric Partridge, in Usage and Abusage, writes that irony consists in stating the contrary of what is meant. The use of irony may require the concept of a double audience. Fowler's A Dictionary of Modern English Usage says, irony is a form of utterance that postulates a double audience consisting of one party that hearing shall hear and shall not understand, and another party that, when more is meant than meets the ear, is aware both of that more and of the outsider's incomprehension. The term is sometimes used as a synonym for incongruous and applied to every trivial oddity in situations where there is no double audience. An example of such usage is Sullivan, whose real interest was, ironically, serious music, which he composed with varying degrees of success, achieved fame for his comic opera scores rather than for his more earnest efforts. The American Heritage Dictionary, a secondary meaning for irony, incongruity between what might be expected and what actually occurs. The sense, however, is not synonymous with incongruous, but merely a definition of dramatic or situational irony. It is often included in definitions of irony not only that incongruity is present, but also that the incongruity must reveal some aspect of human vanity or folly. Thus the majority of American Heritage Dictionary's usage panel found it unacceptable to use the word ironic to describe mere unfortunate coincidences, or surprising disappointments that suggest no particular lessons about human vanity or folly. On this aspect, the Oxford English Dictionary, OED, has also a condition of affairs or events of a character opposite to what was, or might naturally be, expected, a contradictory outcome of events, as if in mockery of the promise and fitness of things. In French, irony du sort. Origin of the term. According to the Encyclopaedia Britannica, the term irony has its roots in the Greek comic character Iron, a clever underdog, who by his wit repeatedly triumphs over the boastful character Alison. The Socratic irony of the Platonic dialogues derives from this comic origin. According to Richard Whately, Aristotle mentions eirōneía, which in his time was commonly employed to signify, not according to the modern use of irony, saying the contrary to what is meant, but what later writers usually express by lightheartedness, i.e., saying less than is meant. The word came into English as a figure of speech in the 16th century, as similar to the French irony. It derives from the Latin eirōneía, and ultimately from the Greek eirōneía, meaning dissimulation, ignorance purposely affected. Types. A no-smoking sign surrounded by images of a smoking Sherlock Holmes at Baker Street Tube Station. The New Princeton Encyclopedia of Poetry and Poetics distinguishes between the following types of irony. Classical irony, referring to the origins of irony in ancient Greek comedy, and the way classical and medieval rhetoricians delineated the term. Romantic irony, the encyclopedia states that the most significant change in meaning took place in 1797, when Schlegel observed in his fragments, "There are ancient and modern poems which breathe throughout, in their entirety, and in every detail, the divine breath of irony." It is seen as a consistent alternation of affirmation and negation, of exuberant emergence from oneself and self-critical retreat into oneself, of enthusiasm and skepticism. Tragic irony, the encyclopedia says this term was introduced by Knop Thirlwall in 1833, who based it on a distinction among three basic types of irony: verbal, dialectic, and practical. Cosmic irony. Irony took on a new and more comprehensive dimension with Hegel, who strongly opposed romantic irony because of its annihilating tendency, seeing in it nothing but poetic caprice. In the history of philosophy, Hegel sensed in the crowding of world historical affairs, in the trampling down of the happiness of peoples, wisdom of states, and virtue of individuals, in short, in his comprehensive view of history, an ironic contrast between the absolute and the relative, the general and the individual, which he expressed by the phrase, general irony of the world. Verbal irony. The encyclopedia states that, in this, one meaning is stated, and a different, usually antithetical, meaning is intended. The irony of a statement often depends on context. If one looks out of his window at a rainstorm and remarks to a friend, "Wonderful day, isn't it?" the contradiction between the facts and the implied description of them establishes the irony. Dramatic irony. A plot device according to which a. the spectators know more than the protagonist, b. the character reacts in a way contrary to that which is appropriate or wise, c. characters or situations are compared or contrasted for ironic effects, such as parody, or d. there is a marked contrast between what the character understands about his acts and what the play demonstrates about them. A disparity of awareness between actor and observer, when words and actions possess significance that the listener or audience understands, but the speaker or character does not. For example, when a character says to another, "I'll see you tomorrow," when the audience, but not the character, knows that the character will die before morning. It is most often used when the author causes a character to speak or act erroneously out of ignorance of some portion of the truth of which the audience is aware. In tragic irony, the audience knows the character is making a mistake, even as the character is making it. Poetic irony. The encyclopedia says that, during the modern period, especially beginning with Romanticism, irony has become inseparable from literary and poetic expression itself. Lars Elstrom would add, situational irony, the disparity of intention and result, when the result of an action is contrary to the desired or expected effect. Verbal irony. According to a glossary of literary terms by Abrams and Hartman, verbal irony is a statement in which the meaning that a speaker employs is sharply different from the meaning that is ostensibly expressed. The ironic statement usually involves the explicit expression of one attitude or evaluation, but with indications, in the overall speech situation, that the speaker intends a very different, and often opposite, attitude or evaluation. Verbal irony is distinguished from situational irony and dramatic irony in that it is produced intentionally by speakers. For instance, if a man exclaims, "I'm not upset," but reveals an upset emotional state through his voice, while truly trying to claim he's not upset, it would not be verbal irony by virtue of its verbal manifestation. It would, however, be situational irony. But if the same speaker said the same words and intended to communicate that he was upset by claiming he was not, the utterance would be verbal irony. This distinction illustrates an important aspect of verbal irony. Speakers communicate implied propositions that are intentionally contradictory to the propositions contained in the words themselves. There are, however, examples of verbal irony that do not rely on saying the opposite of what one means, and there are cases where all the traditional criteria of irony exist, and the utterance is not ironic. In a clear example from literature, in Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, Mark Antony's speech after the assassination of Caesar appears to praise the assassins, particularly Brutus, but Brutus says he was ambitious, and Brutus is an honorable man, while actually condemning them. We are left in no doubt as to who's ambitious and who's honorable. The literal truth of what's written clashes with the perceived truth of what's meant, a revealing effect, which is irony in a nutshell. Ironic similes are a form of verbal irony, where a speaker intends to communicate the opposite of what they mean. For instance, the following explicit similes begin with the deceptive formation of a statement that means A, but that eventually conveys the meaning not A. As soft as concrete. As clear as mud. As pleasant as a root canal. As pleasant and relaxed as a coiled rattlesnake Kurt Vonnegut from Breakfast of Champions. The irony is recognizable in each case only by using knowledge of the source concepts. E.g., that mud is opaque, that root canal surgery is painful, to detect an incongruity. Verbal irony and sarcasm. A fair amount of confusion has surrounded the issue regarding the relationship between verbal irony and sarcasm. Fowler's A Dictionary of Modern English Usage states, sarcasm does not necessarily involve irony, and irony has often no touch of sarcasm. This suggests that the two concepts are linked, but may be considered separately. The entry for sarcasm does not mention irony, but the irony entry reads, a figure of speech in which the intended meaning is the opposite of that expressed by the words used, usually taking the form of sarcasm or ridicule, in which laudatory expressions are used to imply condemnation or contempt. The Encyclopedia Britannica has non-literary irony is often called sarcasm, while the Webster's Dictionary entry is sarcasm, 1. A sharp and often satirical or ironic utterance designed to cut or give pain. 2. A mode of satirical wit depending for its effect on bitter, caustic, and often ironic language that is usually directed against an individual. Partridge in usage and abusage would separate the two forms of speech completely. Irony must not be confused with sarcasm, which is direct. Sarcasm means precisely what it says, but in a sharp, caustic manner. The psychologist Martin, in The Psychology of Humor, is quite clear that irony is where the literal meaning is opposite to the intended, and sarcasm is aggressive humor that pokes fun. He has the following examples. For irony he uses the statement "what a nice day" when it is raining. For sarcasm, he cites Winston Churchill, who is supposed to have said, when told by Bessie Braddock, that he was drunk, "But I shall be sober in the morning. And you will still be ugly," as being sarcastic, while not saying the opposite of what is intended. Psychology researchers Leanne Katz, 1998, have addressed the issue directly. They found that ridicule is an important aspect of sarcasm, but not of verbal irony in general. By this account, sarcasm is a particular kind of personal criticism leveled against a person or group of persons that incorporates verbal irony. For example, a woman reports to her friend that rather than going to a medical doctor to treat her cancer, she has decided to see a spiritual healer instead. In response, her friend says sarcastically, "Oh, brilliant, what an ingenious idea, that's really going to cure you." The friend could have also replied with any number of ironic expressions that should not be labeled as sarcasm exactly, but still have many shared elements with sarcasm. Most instances of verbal irony are labeled by research subjects as sarcastic, suggesting that the term sarcasm is more widely used than its technical definition suggests it should be. Bryant and Foxtree, 2002, Gibbs, 2000. Some psycholinguistic theorists, e.g., Gibbs, 2000, suggest that sarcasm, "Great idea, I hear they do fine work." Hyperbole, "That's the best idea I have heard in years." Understatement, "Sure, what the hell, it's only cancer." Rhetorical questions, "What, does your spirit have cancer?" Double entendre, "I'll bet, if you do that, you'll be communing with spirits in no time." And jocularity, "Get them to fix your bad back while you're at it." Should all be considered forms of verbal irony. The differences between these rhetorical devices, tropes, can be quite subtle, and relate to typical emotional reactions of listeners, and the rhetorical goals of the speakers. Regardless of the various ways theorists categorize figurative language types, people in conversation, who are attempting to interpret speaker intentions and discourse goals, do not generally identify, by name, the kinds of tropes used. Leggett and Gibbs, 2000. Dramatic irony. This type of irony is the device of giving the spectator an item of information that at least one of the characters in the narrative is unaware of, at least consciously, thus placing the spectator a step ahead of at least one of the characters. Poetic has the incongruity created when the tragic significance of a character's speech or actions is revealed to the audience but unknown to the character concerned, the literary device, so used, orig. In Greek tragedy. According to Stanton, dramatic irony has three stages: installation, exploitation, and resolution, often also called preparation, suspension, and resolution, producing dramatic conflict, in what one character relies, or appears to rely upon, the contrary of which is known by observers, especially the audience, sometimes to other characters within the drama, to be true. In summary, it means that the reader/watcher/listener knows something that one or more of the characters in the piece is not aware of. For example, in City Lights, the audience knows that Charlie Chaplin's character is not a millionaire, but the blind flower girl, Virginia Cheryl, believes him to be rich. In North by Northwest, the audience knows that Roger Thornhill, Cary Grant, is not Catelyn Van Damme, James Mason, and his accomplices do not. The audience also knows that Catelyn is a fictitious agent invented by the CIA, Roger, initially, and Van Damme, throughout, do not. In Oedipus the King, the audience knows that Oedipus himself is the murderer, that he is seeking Oedipus, Creon, and Jocasta do not. In Othello, the audience knows that Desdemona has been faithful to Othello, but Othello does not. The audience also knows that Iago is scheming to bring about Othello's downfall, a fact hidden from Othello, Desdemona, Cassio, and Roderigo. In the Cask of Amontillado, the reader knows that Montresor is planning on murdering Fortunato, while Fortunato believes they are friends. In The Truman Show, the viewer is aware that Truman is on a television show, but Truman himself only gradually learns this. In Romeo and Juliet, the audience knows that Juliet is already married to Romeo, but her family does not. Also, in The Crypt, most of the other characters in the cast think Juliet is dead, but the audience knows she only took a sleeping potion. Romeo is also under the same misapprehension when he kills himself. Tragic irony. Tragic irony is a special category of dramatic irony. In tragic irony, the words and actions of the characters contradict the real situation, which the spectators fully realize. The Oxford English Dictionary has the incongruity created when the tragic significance of a character's speech or actions is revealed to the audience, but unknown to the character concerned, the literary device, so used, orig. In Greek tragedy. Ancient Greek drama was especially characterized by tragic irony because the audiences were so familiar with the legends that most of the plays dramatized. Sophocles' Oedipus the King provides a classic example of tragic irony at its fullest. Colebrook writes, tragic irony is exemplified in ancient drama. The audience watched a drama unfold, already knowing its destined outcome. In Sophocles' Oedipus the King, for example, we, the audience, can see what Oedipus is blind to. The man he murders is his father, but he does not know it. Further, Oedipus vows to find the murderer and curses him for the plague that he has caused, not knowing that the murderer he has cursed and vowed to find is himself. Irony has some of its foundation in the onlooker's perception of paradox that arises from insoluble problems. For example, in the William Shakespeare play Romeo and Juliet, when Romeo finds Juliet in a drug death-like sleep, he assumes her to be dead and kills himself. Upon awakening to find her dead lover beside her, Juliet stabs herself with a dagger, thus killing herself. Situational irony. This is a relatively modern use of the term, and describes a sharp discrepancy between the expected result and actual results in a certain situation. Lars Elstrom writes, situational irony is most broadly defined as a situation where the outcome is incongruous with what was expected, but it is also more generally understood as a situation that includes contradictions or sharp contrasts. For example, When John Hinckley attempted to assassinate Ronald Reagan, all of his shots initially missed the president. However, a bullet ricocheted off the bulletproof presidential limousine and struck Reagan in the chest. Thus, a vehicle made to protect the president from gunfire instead directed gunfire to the president. The Wonderful Wizard of Oz is a story whose plot revolves around situational irony. Dorothy travels to a wizard and fulfills his challenging demands to go home before discovering she had the ability to go back home all the time. The Scarecrow longs for intelligence only to discover he is already a genius, and the Tin Woodsman longs to be capable of love only to discover he already has a heart. The Lion, who at first appears to be a whimpering coward, turns out to be bold and fearless. The people in Emerald City believe the wizard to be a powerful deity, only to discover that he is a bumbling, eccentric old man with no special powers at all. In O. Henry's story The Gift of the Magi, a young couple are too poor to buy each other Christmas gifts. The wife cuts off her treasured hair to sell it to a wig maker for money to buy her husband a chain for his heirloom pocket watch. She's shocked when she learns he had pawned his watch to buy her a set of combs for her long, beautiful, prized hair. The double irony lies in the particular way their expectations were foiled. In the ancient Indian story of Krishna, King Kamsa is told in a prophecy that a child of his sister Devaki would kill him. To prevent this, he imprisons both Devaki and her husband Vasudeva, allowing them to live only if they hand over their children as soon as they are born. He murders nearly all of them, one by one, but the seventh and eighth children, Balarama and Krishna, are saved and raised by a royal couple, Nanda and Yashoda. After the boys grow up, Krishna eventually kills Kamsa, as the prophecy foretold. Kamsa's attempt to prevent the prophecy led to it becoming a reality. This story is similar to those in Greek mythology. Cronus prevents his wife from raising any children, but the one who ends up defeating him is Zeus, the later king of the gods. Other similar tales in Greek mythology include Perseus, who killed his grandfather, Acrisius, by accident with a discus despite Acrisius' attempt to avert his fate, and, more famously, Oedipus, who killed his father and married his mother not knowing their relationship, due to being left to die by his father to prevent that very prophecy from occurring. Cosmic irony, irony of fate. The expression cosmic irony or irony of fate stems from the notion that the gods, or the fates, are amusing themselves by toying with the minds of mortals with deliberate ironic intent. Closely connected with situational irony, it arises from sharp contrasts between reality and human ideals, or between human intentions and actual results. The resulting situation is poignantly contrary to what was expected or intended. According to Sutter Dixit, cosmic irony is a term that is usually associated with Thomas Hardy. There is a strong feeling of a hostile deus ex machina in Hardy's novels. In Tess of the Ubervillius, there are several instances of this type of irony. Justice was done, and the president of the immortals, in a phrase, has ended his sport with death. Historical irony. When history is seen through modern eyes, there often appear sharp contrasts between the way historical figures see their world's future and what actually transpires. For example, during the 1920s, the New York Times repeatedly scorned crossword puzzles. In 1924, it lamented the sinful waste in the utterly futile finding of words the letters of which will fit into a prearranged pattern. In 1925 it said the question of whether the puzzles are beneficial or harmful is in no urgent need of an answer. The craze evidently is dying out fast. Today, no U.S. newspaper is more closely identified with the crossword than the New York Times. In a more tragic example of historical irony, what people now refer to as the First World War was called by H.G. Wells the war that will end war, which soon became the war to end war and the war to end all wars, and this became a widespread truism, almost a cliché. Historical irony is therefore a subset of cosmic irony, but one in which the element of time is bound to play a role. Another example could be that of the Vietnam War, where in the 1960s the U.S. attempted to stop the Viet Cong, Vietmen, taking over South Vietnam. However, it is an often ignored fact that, in 1941, the U.S. originally supported the Viet Minh in its fight against Japanese occupation. In the introduction to The Irony of American History, Andrew Bacevich writes, after 9/11, the Bush administration announced its intention of bringing freedom and democracy to the people of the Middle East. Ideologues within the Bush administration persuaded themselves that American power, adroitly employed, could transform that region. The results speak for themselves. Gunpowder was, according to prevailing academic consensus, discovered in the 9th century by Chinese alchemists searching for an elixir of immortality. Historical irony also includes inventors killed by their own creations, such as William Bullock, unless, due to the nature of the invention, the risk of death was always known and accepted, as in the case of Otto Lilienthal, who was killed by flying a glider of his own devising. In certain kinds of situational or historical irony, a factual truth is highlighted by some person's complete ignorance of it or his belief in its opposite. However, this state of affairs does not occur by human design. In some religious contexts, such situations have been seen as the deliberate work of divine providence to emphasize truths and to taunt humans for not being aware of them when they could easily have been enlightened. This is similar to human use of irony. Such ironies are often more evident or more striking when viewed retrospectively in the light of later developments which make the truth of past situations obvious to all. Other prominent examples of outcomes now seen as poignantly contrary to expectation include: in the Dred Scott v. Sandford ruling in 1856, the United States Supreme Court held that the Fifth Amendment barred any law that would deprive a slaveholder of his property, such as his slaves, upon the incidence of migration into free territory. So, in a sense, the Supreme Court used the Bill of Rights to deny rights to slaves. Also, Chief Justice Taney hoped that the decision would resolve the slavery issue, but instead it helped cause the American Civil War. In the Kalgoorlie, Australia, gold rush of the 1890s, large amounts of the little-known mineral calaverite, gold tellurite, were ironically identified as fool's gold. These mineral deposits were used as a cheap building material and for the filling of potholes and ruts. When several years later the mineral was identified, there was a minor gold rush to excavate the streets. John F. Kennedy's last conversation was ironic in light of events which followed seconds later. During the motorcade in Dallas, in response to Mrs. Connolly's comment, "Mr. President, you can say that Dallas doesn't love you," Kennedy replied, "That's very obvious." Immediately after, he was mortally wounded. In 1974, the U.S. Consumer Product Safety Commission had to recall 80,000 of its own lapel buttons promoting toy safety because the buttons had sharp edges, used lead paint, and had small clips that could be broken off and subsequently swallowed. Introducing cane toads to Australia to control the cane beetle not only failed to control the pest, but introduced, in the toads themselves, a very much worse pest. This irony is exemplified by the song "There Was an Old Lady Who Swallowed a Fly," in which the lady swallows a fly, and then swallows a spider to catch the fly, and so on with larger and larger animals until she dies. Kudzu vine imported to the United States in the 1930s and planted all over the South at the direction of the U.S. government to prevent soil erosion. Instead of preventing erosion, it climbs and chokes native trees and plants, thus causing even more erosion. Also, long ago, the city of Birmingham, Alabama outlawed the livestock that would happily be eating the nutritious green kudzu leaves. Use: comic irony. Irony is often used in literature to produce a comic effect. This may also be combined with satire. For instance, an author may facetiously state something as a well-known fact and then demonstrate through the narrative that the fact is untrue. Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice begins with the proposition, it is a truth universally acknowledged, that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. In fact, it soon becomes clear that Austen means the opposite. Women, or their mothers, are always in search of, and desperately on the lookout for, a rich single man to make a husband. The irony deepens as the story promotes this romance and ends in a double marriage proposal. Austen's comic irony emerges out of the disjunction between Elizabeth's overconfidence, or pride, in her perceptions of Darcy, and the narrator's indications that her views are in fact partial and prejudicial. The Third Man is a film that features any number of eccentricities, each of which contributes to the film's perspective of comic irony as well as its overall cinematic self-consciousness. Writing about performances of Shakespeare's Othello in apartheid South Africa, Robert Gordon suggests, could it be that black people in the audience may have viewed as a comic irony his audacity and naivety in thinking he could pass for white? Romantic irony and metafiction. Romantic irony is an attitude of detached skepticism adopted by an author towards his or her work, typically manifesting in literary self-consciousness and self-reflection. This conception of irony originated with the German Romantic writer and critic Karl Wilhelm Friedrich Schlegel. Joseph Dane writes from a 20th-century perspective, the most crucial area in the history of irony is that described by the term romantic irony. He discusses the difficulty of defining romantic irony, but what is romantic irony? A universal type of irony. The irony used by romantics, or an irony envisioned by the romantics and romanticists. He also describes the arguments for and against its use. Referring to earlier self-conscious works such as Don Quixote and Tristram Shandy, Douglas Mackey points particularly to Peter Weiss's 1964 play, Maat/Sod. This work is a play within a play set in a lunatic asylum, in which it is difficult to tell whether the players are speaking only to other players, or also directly to the audience. When the herald says, "The regrettable incident you've just seen was unavoidable, indeed foreseen by our playwright," there is confusion as to who is being addressed, the audience on the stage, or the audience in the theater. Also, since the play within the play is performed by the inmates of a lunatic asylum, the theater audience cannot tell whether the paranoia displayed before them is that of the players, or the people they are portraying. Mackey notes that, in America, romantic irony has had a bad press, while in England, it is almost unknown. However, in a book entitled English Romantic Irony, Anne Mellor, referring to Byron, Keats, Carlyle, Coleridge, and Lewis Carroll, writes, "Romantic irony is both a philosophical conception of the universe and an artistic program. Ontologically, it sees the world as fundamentally chaotic. No order, no far goal of time, ordained by God or right reason, determines the progression of human or natural events. Furthermore, of course, romantic irony itself has more than one mode. The style of romantic irony varies from writer to writer. But however distinctive the voice, a writer is a romantic ironist if and when his or her work commits itself enthusiastically both in content and form to a hovering or unresolved debate between a world of merely man-made being and a world of ontological becoming. Similarly, metafiction is fiction in which the author self-consciously alludes to the artificiality or literariness of a work by parodying or departing from novelistic conventions, e.sp. naturalism, and narrative techniques. It is a type of fiction that self-consciously addresses the devices of fiction, thereby exposing the fictional illusion. Giesing writes that the most common form of metafiction is particularly frequent in romantic literature. The phenomenon is then referred to as romantic irony. Giesing notes that there has obviously been an increased interest in metafiction again after World War II. For examples, Patricia Waugh quotes from several works at the top of her chapter headed "What is Metafiction?" These include: "The thing is this/that of all the several ways of beginning a book, I am confident my own way of doing it is best Tristram Shandy. Fuck all this lying, look what I am trying to write about is writing Albert Angelo. Since I've started this story, I've gotten boils, The Death of the Novel, and other stories by Ronald Suknik." Additionally, the Cambridge Introduction to Postmodern Fiction refers to John Fowlis, the French lieutenant's woman. For the first 12 chapters, the reader has been able to immerse him or herself in the story, enjoying the kind of suspension of disbelief required of realist novels. What follows is a remarkable act of metafictional frame-breaking. Chapter 13 notoriously begins. I do not know. This story I am telling is all imagination. These characters I create never existed outside my own mind. If this is a novel, it cannot be a novel in the modern sense. Socratic irony. Socratic method. This is the dissimulation of ignorance practiced by Socrates, as a means of confuting an adversary. Socrates would pretend to be ignorant of the topic under discussion, to draw out the inherent nonsense in the arguments of his interlocutors. The Chambers Dictionary defines it as a means by which a questioner pretends to know less than a respondent, when actually he knows more. Zoe Williams of The Guardian wrote, the technique of Socratic irony demonstrated in the Platonic dialogues was to pretend ignorance and, more sneakily, to feign credence in your opponent's power of thought, in order to tie him in knots. A more modern example of Socratic irony can be seen on the American crime fiction television film series, Columbo. The character Lieutenant Columbo is seemingly naive and incompetent. His untidy appearance adds to this fumbling illusion. As a result, he is underestimated by the suspects in murder cases he is investigating. With their guard down and their false sense of confidence, Lt. Columbo is able to solve the cases, leaving the murderers feeling duped and outwitted. Irony as infinite, absolute negativity. Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard, and others, see irony, such as that used by Socrates, as a disruptive force with the power to undo texts and readers alike. The phrase itself is taken from Hegel's lectures on aesthetics, and is applied by Kierkegaard to the irony of Socrates. This tradition includes 19th-century German critic and novelist Friedrich Schlegel, on incomprehensibility Charles Baudelaire, Stendhal, and the 20th-century deconstructionist Paul de Man, the concept of irony. In Kierkegaard's words, from On the Concept of Irony with continual reference to Socrates. Socratic irony is the infinite absolute negativity. It is negativity because it only negates. It is infinite because it does not negate this or that phenomenon. It is absolute because that by virtue of which it negates is a higher something that still is not. The irony establishes nothing because that which is to be established lies behind it. Where much of philosophy attempts to reconcile opposites into a larger positive project, Kierkegaard and others insist that irony, whether expressed in complex games of authorship or simple lighteties, must, in Kierkegaard's words, swallow its own stomach. Irony entails endless reflection and violent reversals, and ensures incomprehensibility at the moment it compels speech. Similarly, among other literary critics, writer David Foster Wallace viewed the pervasiveness of ironic and other postmodern tropes as the cause of great despair and stasis in U.S. culture, and that for aspiring fictionists ironies pose terrifically vexing problems. Irony and awkwardness. The 90s saw an expansion of the definition of irony from saying what one doesn't mean into a general stance of detachment from life in general. This detachment served as a shield against the awkwardness of everyday life. Humor from that era, most notably Seinfeld, relies on the audience watching the show with some detachment from the show's typical signature awkward situations. The generation of people in the United States who grew up in the 90s, millennials, are seen as having the same sort of detachment from serious or awkward situations in life as well. Hipsters are thought of as using irony as a shield against those same serious or genuine confrontations. Misuse. The words irony and ironic are often misused. Dan Shaughnessy wrote, "We were always kidding about the use of irony. I maintained that it was best never to use the word because it was too often substituted for coincidence. Alanis Morissette's song Isn't It Ironic? Cites multiple examples of things that are patently not ironic. Tim Conley cites the following. Philip Howard assembled a list of 7 implied meanings for the word ironically as it opens a sentence. By a tragic coincidence. By an exceptional coincidence. by a coincidence of no importance. You and I know, of course, though other less intelligent mortals walk benighted under the midday sun. Oddly enough, or it's a rum thing that... Oh hell. I've run out of words to start a sentence with. Punctuation. No agreed method for indicating irony exists, though many ideas have been suggested. For instance, an irony punctuation mark was proposed in the 1580s, when Henry Denham introduced a rhetorical question mark or percontation point which resembles a reverse question mark. This mark was also advocated by the French poet Marcel Bernhardt at the end of the 19th century to indicate irony or sarcasm. French writer Hervé Bazin suggested another point irony, the Greek letter psi, with a dot below it, while Tom Dryburgh recommended that ironic statements should be printed in italics, that lean the other way to conventional italics.